On the night of August 4th, 1964, President Johnson appeared on national television. He told the American people that 2 U.S. destroyers, the Maddox and the Turner Joy, while on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, had been attacked by North Vietnamese PT boats. He said neither ship had suffered any damage or any casualties. The incident, however, gave President Johnson enough cause to immediately order limited airstrikes against North Vietnam and thus escalate the war. Shortly thereafter, on August 7th, the U.S. Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which gave President Johnson blanket approval to continue his policies in Vietnam, and specifically allowed the President, as Commander-in-Chief, to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. In essence, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution gave the President the power to make war in the absence of a congressional declaration of war.
America and the Vietnam War. America, in the middle of the 20th century, the superpower of the world that changed the fate of 2 world wars, decided to intervene in a small country called Vietnam to prevent it from falling into the hands of communists. What was the story of Vietnam? Why was it tied up in such a way that the superpower of the world, with all its money, weapons, and superior technology, could not win a war in a poor and small country? This video addresses these questions. The Vietnam War. The war lasted for 20 years, with more than 1 million Americans sent to Vietnam. In the end, it ended with defeat, leaving Vietnam empty-handed, despite the immense loss of life and resources. It became the first failure in the history of America, even by its own standards. Why Vietnam? What was happening in Vietnam? If we look at its history, we see that Vietnam was almost always under occupation. It was occupied by China, occupied by Japan, occupied by France, and eventually came under the involvement of the United States. Vietnam's historical struggles. Since the 19th century, when China entered its century of humiliation, Vietnam, long dominated by China, became vulnerable. As China weakened, European powers grew stronger. France entered the scene, and by 1884 had conquered most of Vietnam's territory, making it part of French Indochina and a French colony. Under the guise of bringing civilization, the French introduced Christianity, built roads and constructed hospitals, but their actions were deeply colonial and exploitative. The Vietnamese were ruled by puppet regimes under the French. As with other colonial histories, such as in India, South Africa, and even America, the French government's direct control over its colonies was limited. Colonial authorities often operated autonomously, implementing oppressive policies that suppressed Vietnamese identity. Simply identifying as Vietnamese could be considered a crime under colonial rule. The birth of Vietnamese resistance. Whatever the circumstances, protests, uprisings and movements emerged in Vietnam but were consistently suppressed. As a result, a cohesive movement could not form within Vietnam itself. Instead, Vietnamese individuals living abroad began to organize revolutionary movements, most notably in France. It was in France that the seeds of resistance were sown. France, a hub for Vietnamese revolutionaries. In France, Vietnamese students who had managed to fund their studies became exposed to socialist and communist ideologies during the early 20th century. These ideas, promising equality and freedom from imperialism, inspired many Vietnamese exiles. At that time, communism had not yet been implemented as a governing ideology in the Soviet Union or China, and it appeared to many as a liberating force. By the early 1930s, a political movement for Vietnamese independence began to take shape in France. Among its most prominent figures was Ho Chi Minh, a name that continues to resonate in history. Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary journey began as early as 1911. He participated in demonstrations against the Vietnamese Empire and became a dedicated anti-colonial fighter. After escaping Vietnam, he spent 30 years in exile, traveling across Europe and America, where he connected with other Vietnamese nationalists and carried out anti-imperialist activities. The Paris Peace Conference and a missed opportunity. After the First World War, global leaders convened at the Paris Peace Conference to determine the post-war world order. America, emerging as a new superpower, championed the idea of a war to end all wars and envisioned a world free from war and colonialism. This rhetoric resonated with colonies and nations devastated by war and imperialism. At this pivotal moment, Ho Chi Minh submitted a petition to President Woodrow Wilson on behalf of Vietnam. The petition called for Vietnam's independence and sought support from the global powers. However, the plea likely never reached Wilson, as it was ignored by the prevailing colonial powers. This episode remains a notable moment in Ho Chi Minh's story and Vietnam's struggle for independence. Influence of communism and continued resistance. Ho Chi Minh was deeply influenced by Lenin's anti-colonial teachings. He later travelled to China, where he connected with Chinese communists and organised classes on communism. Despite facing coups, massacres and anti-communist movements in the region, he persisted. His dedication and leadership became central to Vietnam's eventual fight for independence. Ho Chi Minh's global journey and growing influence. Ho Chi Minh's movements during this period were relentless and difficult to track. He moved between the Soviet Union, Europe and Hong Kong, constantly changing names and locations. Despite these challenges, he remained committed to building organizations, creating networks, and expanding his influence and power. In 1930, the first meeting of the Communist Party of India and China was held, with Ho Chi Minh serving as the meeting secretary. His focus was clear: resisting colonial powers, including France. The Second World War and Vietnam. The next significant event in this timeline was the Second World War. During the war, Germany occupied France and waged campaigns in Europe, while Japan expanded its empire in Asia. Japan invaded Vietnam, deploying military forces into the Indochina region, pressuring the population and asserting control over the territory. By 1941, during Japan's occupation of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh saw an opportunity. He returned to Vietnam and established a resistance group called the Viet Minh, aiming to unite the Vietnamese people against Japanese forces. By the war's end in 1945, the Viet Minh had amassed 10,000 guerrilla fighters, engaging in hit-and-run tactics that laid the groundwork for Vietnam's later wars, including the war with the United States. America and Ho Chi Minh, a brief alliance. The Second World War continued in Asia as it did in Europe. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States joined the war with a determined resolve to defeat Japan. In this context, Ho Chi Minh sought American support, asking for weapons to aid in his fight against the Japanese. The Americans provided assistance, and Ho Chi Minh admired their democratic ideals and military efficiency. During this period, the relationship between Ho Chi Minh's communist guerrilla fighters and the United States mirrored the wartime cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union. Both sides worked together against a common enemy, Japan. This collaboration lasted until the end of the war. The post-war world, a turning point for Vietnam. By the end of the war, Japan was defeated, and Ho Chi Minh saw this as the moment for Vietnam's independence. He declared that colonialism and Japanese occupation were over, and it was time for Vietnam to become independent. The future appeared bright for Vietnam, if the global political landscape remained stable. However, the world changed, as it often does. The end of the Second World War marked the beginning of new geopolitical realities. A deep divide emerged among the victors. The uneasy alliance between the West and the Soviet Union fractured, giving rise to the Cold War. A new alignment formed, pitting America and its allies against the Soviet Union and its affiliates. In this new world order, President Truman replaced Roosevelt, and the United States adopted a more confrontational stance against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had consolidated control over Eastern Europe, while France, weakened and humiliated by its wartime losses, found itself in a shifting global dynamic. Vietnam's path to independence became entangled in this emerging Cold War, setting the stage for decades of conflict. France and the First Indochina War. After World War II, France faced challenges in maintaining its influence and independence amidst the global dominance of the United States. Seeking to regain its former power, France turned to its colonies, including Vietnam. This move was justified by the domino effect theory. the fear that if one country fell to communism, others would follow, like dominoes. Using this rationale, France returned to Vietnam, plunging the country into war and conflict. France's primary opposition in Vietnam was the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh. These forces, which had once allied with the West to fight against Japan during World War II using American weapons, now turned against France. Employing guerrilla tactics, the Viet Minh carried out bombings, train explosions, and other insurgent actions. This time, the Viet Minh were supported by China and the Soviet Union rather than the United States. The war lasted for 9 years, with intense fighting in Vietnam's forests and challenging terrain. By 1954, France, unable to sustain the conflict, agreed to a ceasefire. As a result of the ceasefire, Vietnam was divided into 2 parts, similar to the divisions of Korea and Germany after World War II. North Vietnam, aligned with the Soviet Union and China, led by Ho Chi Minh, who became its president. South Vietnam, supported by the United States, with its president, Diem, a Catholic Christian, ruling over a predominantly Buddhist population. This division set the stage for continued conflict, as both sides aimed to reunify Vietnam under their respective ideologies. Ho Chi Minh's vision and the role of the United States. Ho Chi Minh sought to unify Vietnam under communism, following the example of Mao Zedong in China. After Japan's defeat in World War II, Mao's forces had waged a civil war against the nationalists and American allies, ultimately establishing the People's Republic of China as a communist state. Ho Chi Minh hoped to achieve the same in Vietnam. However, the United States, determined to prevent the spread of communism, backed South Vietnam. Despite this support, the South Vietnamese government lacked legitimacy and stability. Its leader, Diem, faced significant challenges. He was unpopular due to his focus on Catholic rule in a majority Buddhist country. His administration was resistant to land reforms and rural development programs. While anti-communism was sufficient to secure American backing, it did little to strengthen his internal authority. The conflict escalated as Ho Chi Minh's forces, now known as the Viet Cong, launched attacks against the South Vietnamese army. Using the same guerrilla tactics developed during the fight against Japan and France, the Viet Cong employed irregular warfare, setting traps and ambushes in South Vietnam's villages and forests. Meanwhile, the world watched as the United States supported South Vietnam in its struggle against communist forces, marking the beginning of deeper American involvement in what would become the Vietnam War. As communism advanced, America adopted the domino theory, the belief that if Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow like falling dominoes. This theory painted a dire picture. If Vietnam became communist, regions like Thailand, the Philippines, and even India might follow. To prevent another China scenario, the United States felt compelled to act. The groundwork was laid for US intervention in Vietnam to stop the communists before their influence spread closer to American shores. The domino theory was first articulated during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower. However, Eisenhower chose not to intervene directly in Vietnam. Whether due to the pressures he faced or his belief that non-interference was the right decision, he left the issue unresolved. As his term ended, he passed the decision to his successor without committing to action. Kennedy's approach to Vietnam. When John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency, the Cold War tensions had heightened. Khrushchev's provocations, the construction of the Berlin Wall, and the spread of communism in Laos and Cambodia added to the urgency. On Kennedy's desk lay the question, what should America do about Vietnam? Kennedy, however, was hesitant to send combat troops. Known for his skepticism about war and military interventions, he resisted direct involvement, believing that war would not provide a clear answer. Instead, he opted for a more measured approach. Kennedy authorized the deployment of military advisors and expert soldiers to assist the South Vietnamese army. He also approved sending weapons and helicopters. Over time, the US budget allocated to Vietnam increased steadily, signaling a slow but steady escalation of involvement. The protests in South Vietnam. South Vietnam's government, closely aligned with the United States, was riddled with corruption and repression. Protests and demonstrations against the regime grew, particularly among the Buddhist population. The turning point came when a Buddhist monk, in a public act of protest, set himself on fire in the middle of the street. This shocking act of self-immolation was a response to government oppression. Other monks followed, intensifying the protests. The South Vietnamese government responded with heavy-handed repression and military action, further stifling the people's desire for freedom. The situation starkly contrasted with America's proclaimed ideals of democracy, yet the US remained an ally of the regime. The media amplified the crisis, and public outrage in American society added to the administration's burden. The situation became increasingly difficult to ignore. Amid the turmoil, a violent coup took place in South Vietnam. With CIA involvement and logistical and financial support from the US, the coup led to the assassination of South Vietnam's president and his brother. Whether Kennedy explicitly approved the coup remains uncertain, but the CIA's involvement was clear. The coup resolved some immediate issues, but the main problems remained. Questions about who would govern South Vietnam and how to stabilize the region loomed large. Shortly after these events, Kennedy was assassinated, leaving a legacy of unresolved challenges and a deepening quagmire in Vietnam. Kennedy's assassination and Johnson's ascension. Following Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency. The question now was how Johnson would address the escalating Vietnam crisis. The stakes were high. Pulling out of Vietnam risked a domino effect, potentially leading to the entire region falling to communism. Alternatively, committing American forces could escalate the conflict into either a Third World War or another Korean War. The situation placed Johnson under immense pressure from all sides, with critics demanding action, while many remained unaware of the complexities on the ground. In private conversations, Johnson expressed his doubts and fears about the situation. As Kennedy's vice president, he had opposed the coup in South Vietnam, fearing it would worsen the instability. His fears were realized. After the coup, the situation in South Vietnam deteriorated rapidly. Communist forces from North Vietnam launched attacks on the South, and within 2 years, South Vietnam experienced 8 coups, further destabilizing the government. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. The turning point came with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. At the time, it was reported that North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked American ships. There were 2 separate incidents reported, though the details remain controversial. Reports suggested conflicting accounts, with some later evidence indicating that the attacks were exaggerated or may not have occurred at all. Based on these reports, Johnson sought and received authorization from the US Congress to take whatever actions he deemed necessary to protect American interests in the region. This resolution effectively granted Johnson broad powers to escalate US involvement in Vietnam, marking a significant turning point in the conflict. Johnson's decision to escalate the conflict was driven by multiple factors: containment policy, the need to prevent the spread of communism and ensure Vietnam did not follow the path of China, social and political pressure, the fear of losing public support and facing criticism from political opponents for not doing enough to combat communism, national security concerns, protecting US interests in Southeast Asia and maintaining credibility as a global superpower. Johnson himself admitted he did not want to be the president who allowed Southeast Asia to be like China. Despite his initial reluctance, the cumulative pressures led to a crucial decision: to authorize attacks on North Vietnam and significantly escalate American involvement in the war. The decision to attack North Vietnam marked a new phase in the conflict, escalating the war to unprecedented levels. Johnson's actions, shaped by geopolitical fears, domestic pressures, and Cold War dynamics, would have far-reaching consequences for both Vietnam and the United States. The decision for America to attack Vietnam remains a topic of debate even decades later. After more than 50 or 60 years, historians and political analysts continue to discuss and question the rationale behind the decision. The attack wasn't simply about carpet bombing or indiscriminate warfare. It involved targeted airstrikes on specific locations in North Vietnam. The US refrained from deploying large numbers of ground troops initially, focusing instead on bombing campaigns. The root of America's actions lies in its perception of the world during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States viewed almost every geopolitical issue through the lens of its rivalry with the Soviet Union. This often led to misinterpretations and miscalculations. The conflict in Vietnam, which some argue was primarily a civil war and a war of independence, was instead framed as part of the Cold War struggle against communism. Robert McNamara, who served as Secretary of Defense under both Kennedy and Johnson, later reflected on these decisions in the documentary The Fog of War. He acknowledged that America's view of Vietnam and its connection to the Cold War was fundamentally flawed from the outset. According to McNamara, Vietnam was not simply a Cold War battleground, but a civil war and a fight for independence. US policymakers knew the situation in Vietnam was deteriorating, but failed to be transparent with the public. Social and political pressures led to decisions that were poorly thought out and, ultimately, incredibly costly. McNamara highlighted how the government created a gap between the realities of Vietnam and what was presented to the public. This disconnect made it difficult for policymakers to defend their actions or make informed decisions. President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered the bombing of North Vietnam because he believed the North Vietnamese were preparing to escalate their attacks. Johnson saw this as an opportunity to raise the level of tension and push for US victory. However, this assumption was flawed, as later assessments revealed that the perceived threats were exaggerated or mistaken. The bombing campaigns, initially justified as responses to alleged North Vietnamese attacks on American ships, became extensive and detached from the original claims. The strategy focused on dropping bombs on strategic targets in North Vietnam, without publicly acknowledging the full scale of the operations. Overconfidence and misjudgment. The bombing campaign reflected the overconfidence of the United States in the second half of the 20th century. Having emerged victorious in World War II, America believed its military dominance would ensure success in Vietnam. The general assumption was that if America entered a war, it would inevitably win. This belief fueled the prolonged bombing campaigns, which aimed to weaken the North Vietnamese and force them to surrender. However, for years, the US government publicly maintained that it was not engaged in full-scale war in Vietnam. Officials described American involvement as limited to advisors, while internally they knew this was far from the truth. Eventually, leaked information revealed the reality of the situation, exposing the worsening conditions in Vietnam. A costly mistake. Johnson's decision to attack Vietnam is now widely regarded as a significant and costly mistake. What began as targeted bombings evolved into a prolonged and devastating conflict. The damage extended beyond Vietnam, impacting American society and leaving a legacy of mistrust and debate over the government's actions. This misjudgment underscores the profound consequences of viewing complex situations through the narrow framework of Cold War ideologies, a lesson that continues to resonate in discussions of American foreign policy. As years of bombing failed to achieve their objectives, President Lyndon B. Johnson was forced to escalate US involvement by deploying ground troops. In the spring of 1965, the first American ground forces arrived in Vietnam. By the end of that year, 200,000 soldiers had been deployed. These soldiers were not there to simply train local forces. They were sent to fight. Vietnam had become the new Western Front, but America's efforts to collect or regain control of the situation were unsuccessful. The unfamiliar and challenging geography, combined with the resilience of the opposition, meant the US was no longer fighting for ideological reasons alone. From a certain point, America was fighting to preserve its reputation and avoid humiliation. Domestically, the situation placed Johnson under significant pressure. His rivals in the election accused him of dishonesty, claiming the president was misleading the American public about the true nature of the conflict. By 1966, the Viet Cong controlled 3/4 of Vietnam, and the situation worsened as the war began to involve Vietnam's neutral neighbours. The importance of logistics. Logistics played a crucial role in the war, as it does in any military conflict. In South Vietnam, the Viet Cong built an extensive network of tunnels, stretching hundreds of kilometres. These tunnels served multiple purposes, including storage, troop movement, clinics, rest areas and shelters. Some tunnels even extended near Saigon, the capital. In the north, the Ho Chi Minh Trail became a vital supply line for moving troops and ammunition. This route passed through Laos, and the Americans sought to destroy it through relentless bombing campaigns. During the Vietnam War, the US dropped 3 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This was more than the total bombing conducted by Germany and Japan during World War II. The bombing wasn't limited to strategic targets. Areas suspected of harboring Viet Cong guerrilla forces were declared free fire zones. In these zones, anything that moved could be treated as an enemy target, often leading to indiscriminate killing of civilians. Contradictions and propaganda. Despite the escalating violence, President Johnson continued to reassure the American public that the situation was under control. Reports of progress were framed around metrics like how many enemy combatants had been killed. For instance, it was claimed that for every 1 American killed, 10 Vietnamese soldiers were killed. This approach highlighted the stark differences in perspective between the two nations. For the Americans, even a single US soldier's death was a cause for public protest and outrage. For the Vietnamese, led by Ho Chi Minh, the loss of life was seen through the lens of their centuries-long struggle for independence. The war's human toll was devastating. American and Vietnamese lives were lost in staggering numbers. While the Americans viewed their casualties as a reason to reconsider the war, the Vietnamese saw their sacrifices as a necessary price for independence. This contrast fueled the persistence of the Vietnamese forces, prolonging a conflict that would leave a lasting scar on both nations. The anti-war movement in American society. As the Vietnam War dragged on, opposition within American society began to grow. Initially, the public generally supported the war. However, as the conflict escalated and casualties mounted, diverse groups began to voice their dissent. Academics, religious leaders, civil rights activists, artists, and ordinary citizens joined the anti-war movement. Protest marches became larger, and campaigns of civil disobedience emerged, particularly against conscription. One of the most notable acts of resistance came from Muhammad Ali, who refused to be drafted into the army. His defiance gained widespread media attention, and although he was initially banned from boxing, the eventual court ruling in his favour elevated his story into a symbol of resistance. Similarly, Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the civil rights movement, openly campaigned against the war, further amplifying anti-war voices. Doubts about the war's purpose. A significant source of public dissatisfaction was the unclear purpose of the war. Unlike World War II, where the enemy was seen as a clear evil, or the Korean War, which was framed as a defense of South Korea against aggression from the North, the Vietnam War's justification felt vague. Arguments about stopping communism and the domino effect no longer resonated with the American public. For many, the war seemed to yield only mounting casualties and destruction without a tangible goal. Parents mourned the loss of their sons, who were sent to fight in the jungles of Vietnam. High school graduates went off to war, only to die in distant forests. The lack of a clear objective further fueled the growing discontent, leaving President Lyndon B. Johnson to contend with increasing opposition at home. The challenges of guerrilla warfare. In Vietnam, the US faced a formidable enemy in the Viet Cong, who were well versed in the terrain and excelled in guerrilla tactics. Despite the extensive use of bombing campaigns, napalm, and defoliants like Agent Orange, the Americans struggled to gain an advantage. These tactics caused long-term environmental and human damage, further eroding support for the war, both domestically and internationally. By 1968, the US had deployed over 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam, yet the situation showed little improvement. The Ho Chi Minh forces launched surprise attacks, often using guerrilla and irregular methods, demonstrating their resilience and deep knowledge of the region. The Tet Offensive, a turning point. During the Tet holiday in 1968, the Ho Chi Minh forces launched a surprise large-scale operation known as the Tet Offensive. For the first time, they attacked cities, including the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, and even struck the American embassy. Although these attacks were ultimately unsuccessful, they inflicted significant damage on America's reputation. The sight of the North Vietnamese forces reaching urban centers, including the capital, contradicted claims that the war was nearing its end. In military terms, the Tet Offensive was a significant victory for the US, with 84,000 Viet Cong soldiers killed and another 54,000 wounded or captured. However, This success could not be translated into propaganda. The American public, already skeptical of government narratives, saw the images of North Vietnamese forces attacking cities and the US embassy as evidence that the war was far from over. The government's reassurances that victory was imminent clashed with the stark realities on the ground. As more images and reports surfaced, showing the war's brutality and the resilience of the Viet Cong, public trust in the government eroded further. The anti-war movement gained momentum, and American society became deeply divided over the conflict. As the Vietnam War dragged on, the American public increasingly questioned its purpose. Incidents like the massacre of over 500 non-combatants in a South Vietnamese village shocked the nation, amplifying the voices asking, "Why are we fighting? How far will this go? When will it end?" Johnson's declining popularity. The war severely damaged President Lyndon B. Johnson's standing, even within his own Democratic Party. His once successful domestic policies were overshadowed by the war, and his political achievements were increasingly questioned. Recognizing that the Vietnam War consumed all attention and resources, Johnson decided not to run for re-election, effectively ending his political career. He announced his intention to focus on achieving peace in Vietnam, including halting the bombing of North Vietnam and initiating negotiations. The Vietnam War deepened divisions in American society to levels not seen since the Civil War. By this time, fewer than half of the total American deaths in the war had occurred, yet the public's dissatisfaction had reached a breaking point. In 1968, the country faced further turmoil. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the civil rights movement, was assassinated. Robert Kennedy, a Democratic presidential candidate and vocal critic of the Vietnam War, was also assassinated. These events underscored the volatile political and social climate of the time. The nation was clear. Whoever became president had to be capable of ending the war. Nixon's entry and the stalled peace talks. The Republican candidate Richard Nixon, along with his advisor Henry Kissinger, positioned themselves as the team to end the Vietnam War. However, behind the scenes, Nixon's campaign engaged in actions that delayed peace. In the final days before the election, representatives of Nixon's campaign reportedly contacted South Vietnamese leaders, urging them to halt peace negotiations, promising that Nixon would secure better terms for them once in office. This maneuver effectively postponed peace, which many, including Johnson, considered an act of treason. By pushing back peace efforts, the delay meant more lives lost, both American and Vietnamese, while the war continued unnecessarily. The cost of delay. The consequences of delaying peace were catastrophic. American casualties after this point were as high as all previous losses combined. Nixon became the third president directly involved in Vietnam, inheriting a war that had already consumed Johnson's presidency and tarnished America's reputation. Johnson himself became a political casualty of Vietnam, caught between his decisions and the war's unrelenting toll. Now it was Nixon's turn to confront the conflict with his policy agenda. Vietnamization was introduced as a strategy to transfer the responsibility for the war to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, in South Vietnam. The plan was for American forces to withdraw, leaving behind weapons and resources for the South Vietnamese to continue the fight against the Viet Cong. However, the strategy was fundamentally flawed. If the United States, with 500,000 soldiers and direct involvement, couldn't defeat North Vietnam, how could the ARVN succeed alone? Despite these concerns, the plan was presented as a path to withdrawal. Alongside this strategy, President Richard Nixon launched tactical bombings targeting Viet Cong sanctuaries in Cambodia. Cambodia had declared neutrality, but Nixon's administration, working closely with Henry Kissinger, began operations that would further destabilize the region. The role of Cambodia and tactical bombing. The Viet Cong had sought refuge in Cambodia, and Nixon's administration decided to strike these shelters. The attacks, under the guise of targeting sparsely populated areas in eastern Cambodia, were devastating. In reality, these bombings killed many civilians, exacerbating the situation in a country already grappling with a civil war. Cambodia became a ruinous battleground, enabling the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a communist regime that would later perpetrate genocide. killing an estimated 20% of Cambodia's population within 4 years. Nixon and Kissinger believed that showing military strength and terror would force North Vietnam to make concessions during peace talks. However, this strategy had far-reaching consequences, destabilizing Cambodia and creating an anti-American atmosphere that fueled further conflict. The Christmas bombings. One of the most infamous actions of the Vietnam War was the Christmas bombings in December 1972. Over 20,000 tons of explosives were dropped on military and industrial facilities in North Vietnam. This unprecedented bombing campaign, the largest since World War II, marked the final major American offensive in the Vietnam War. By January 1973, the Paris peace talks reached a conclusion. The agreement stipulated North Vietnam would release American prisoners of war. The United States would withdraw its forces. North and South Vietnam would resolve their future through elections and negotiations. The Nobel Peace Prize and controversy. The negotiations were led by Henry Kissinger for the United States and Le Duc Tho for North Vietnam. That year, both were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, but Le Duc Tho refused the prize, stating that the war and its disasters were largely the result of American actions. He saw no true peace to celebrate, considering the devastation caused by Kissinger's policies. The aftermath, US withdrawal and broken promises. Although America withdrew, the war was far from over. Kissinger had promised South Vietnam that the US would return to support them if the communists launched a major offensive. However, by the time the Watergate scandal forced Nixon to resign, the US government was no longer willing or able to fulfill this promise. Public and congressional support for Vietnam had eroded. Congress halved the budget allocated for aiding South Vietnam, leaving the country to fend for itself. America exited Vietnam with no political or military resolution to show for its efforts. In 1975, North Vietnam launched a major offensive against the South. As Saigon fell to communist forces, Americans and South Vietnamese desperately tried to escape, clinging to helicopters leaving the city. This marked the official end of the Vietnam War. By the war's conclusion, 10% of Vietnam's population had perished, a staggering toll for a conflict that might never have begun or could have ended sooner if not for a series of devastating mistakes. The war, which dragged on for years, had no true winner. It became a costly and fruitless effort for both sides. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam. In 1976, North and South Vietnam were unified into the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. While some South Vietnamese officials protested the unification, they lacked the power, resources, or will to resist. Vietnam adopted communist policies similar to the Soviet Chinese model, including the nationalization of industries, collectivization of agriculture, and programs for ideological purification. Many Vietnamese sought to flee the country, resulting in tragic losses at sea, with 10% of those attempting to escape dying in the process. Gradually, relations with the United States began to normalize, starting with efforts by President Jimmy Carter. The normalization of relations with Vietnam was delayed, partly because the US had just normalized relations with China. By the 1980s, Vietnam opened up to foreign investment, setting the stage for its gradual economic transformation into the nation we recognize today. The Pentagon Papers and public distrust. The Vietnam War significantly eroded American trust in the government. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed the extent of lies and cover-ups by successive administrations. These documents exposed secret bombings in Laos and Cambodia, unapproved and undisclosed military operations, years of unjustifiable violence funded by American taxpayers without congressional approval. The revelations fueled public disillusionment, making it increasingly difficult for the government to justify or sustain wars without public or congressional support. Vietnam was often described as two wars. The Cold War. For the Americans, it was a fight against communism. The War for Independence. For the Vietnamese, it was the culmination of a centuries-long struggle for independence. American policymakers, including Robert McNamara, later admitted their mistakes. McNamara reflected that the US failed to understand Vietnam's perspective, seeing the conflict solely through the lens of the Cold War. To the Vietnamese, America was just another colonial force, akin to France seeking to dominate their nation. In hindsight, McNamara noted, "If we had understood what the Vietnamese wanted and where they stood, we might have achieved our goals without the devastating cost of the war." This sentiment was echoed in a post-war meeting between McNamara and the North Vietnamese Prime Minister, who remarked that Vietnam fought for its independence from all powers, including China and Russia, long before the US involvement. The Vietnam War remains the first war that the United States officially lost, leaving lasting scars on American society and foreign policy. Decades later, discussions about Vietnam continue to focus on the lessons learned, the mistakes repeated, and the broader implications for future conflicts. Lessons from history. The Vietnam War also draws comparisons to other historical events. The US alliance with the Viet Minh during World War II to fight Japan parallels the arming of Afghan mujahideen during the 1980s to resist Soviet invaders. In both cases, shifting geopolitics turned former allies into adversaries, with unintended long-term consequences. And the journey of Ho Chi Minh to France after World War I, where he embraced communism, echoes the path of Deng Xiaoping, who also became a communist after studying in France and Moscow. Both leaders shaped their countries in profound ways,